to have to transplant myself out of here. Called my daughter's school for a meeting, so some things take, but no, it's okay. But I got to do it. And another apology is my kind of concerns and expertise are a little peripheral to this conference, but Roy knew that when he asked me to give the comment, but I tried to make it relevant nonetheless. So the theme of the conference, as reflected in its title, is methodologies and markets. And Ron's approach to the issue of legal transplantation implicates markets in two aspects. One is the objective study, so he's talking about companies law and business law or economic law more broadly, and the other is the methodology. And I'm going to focus on the methodology. The methodology is historical, but with an economic inflection. Influences of new economic history, new institutional economics, examination of the supply and demand of legal institutions, a focus on transaction costs of legal transplantation, balanced against its benefits, and so on. Now, this kind of framing and theorizing of historic transplantation is not self-evident. One might have employed perspectives from anthropology, cultural history, study of the professions, history of knowledge, and so on. But Ron's methodology, alongside the theory, is also empirical and skeptical, and he repeatedly challenges the theoretical postulates of economic theory with empirical evidence gathered from his historical research, and he usually finds the theory to come up short, or to use Roy's terms from before, he's context over concepts. And I share overlapping interests with Ron, perhaps not surprising. My first university history class, he was the TA. My first legal history class, he was the professor. And I, too, am particularly interested in the circulation of law and legal ideas with a focus on the British Empire. On the other hand, I have only slight interest in business organizations and even less knowledge of business organizations, so I will focus on the methodology, as I said. In particular, I would like to offer some friendly observations to further question the utility of economic analysis of legal transplantations, or, as I would argue, we should privilege context over concepts here. So before getting to my particular comments, I would like to tie Ron's paper back to Roy's binary. The two sides in the debate over legal transplants set up by Alan Watson in the 1970s, to a large extent, track the dichotomy of context and concept. On the one hand, we have the contextualists, from Montesquieu through Law and Society, through Pierre Legrand, who declared that legal transplants are impossible. And on the other hand, those like Watson, who believe not only that legal concepts have real power to make law, but that these concepts travel light, unburdened by context. I bring this up firstly because to some extent, Ron's paper moves between these poles, particularly the tension between economic theorizing, which seeks historical rules of general applicability, and his historical research based on primary sources, which is highly attuned to context. But I mention it also because this division seems to do work not only on the level of theory and historiography, but also because in the law itself, the forces encouraging and impeding transplantation seem to be aligned with these two poles. On the one hand, we have the forces encouraging transplantation, which might be seen as motivated by a belief in the power of concept, while those stymieing it can usually be characterized as motivated by context. So now to some more specific comments. So first, Ron quotes Westbrook as implying that the typical context of legal transplantation was that of empire. And I think it's worth noting that this was not Alan Watson's position. In fact, the classic cases of transplantation studied by Watson and others were the spread of Roman law throughout Western Europe, centuries after the end of the Roman Empire, and the influence of French civil law in far-flung territories, particularly in the New World, not ruled by the French. In fact, when we look at the overall picture of legal transplantation in the British Empire, what stands out for me is not the empire as a force for legal diffusion, but rather how little transplantation of English law actually happened under British rule. And that may be different than in other empires. If we stop and think about it, it's really not so surprising either. As Ron notes with regard to companies law, the British were not particularly interested in transplanting their own law to the colonies. And in my research on other areas of law, I've also rarely found such interest among the British rulers. In fact, what we do find is a fair amount of interest by the British in the local legal systems, including the sponsoring of projects to have officials and scholars study and explain these legal systems. And while there certainly was some diffusion of English law in the empire, this needs to be thought about alongside the not inconsiderable amount of transplantation of non-English law that took place in the empire. For instance, the movement of ideas about Roman Dutch law between many former Dutch colonies, with British scholars in England and Scotland active in the process, or we can think about Islamic law, which moves around the British Empire, and so on. So even if we accept that empire facilitated transfer of law by lowering transaction costs, it was not necessarily the law of the metropole that was transplanted as a result. And I would add in parentheses that the idea of metropolitan law is problematic in the British case, where the supposed law of the imperial center was English, was assumed to be English, but the legal officials were often Scottish, with their own legal system. So that's so much for the supply side, as Ron would put it. On the side of reception, Ron posits some theoretical assumptions that I would like to question. Sorry, get my pages mixed up here. One is that areas of law dominated by common law rules, embodied in judicial precedents, are harder to transfer than areas of law, such as companies law, that are primarily statutory, due to the supposed difficulty or cost of ascertaining the law made by judges in scattered cases. So when we consider whether this is indeed the case, I would call to attention what we all know, the relative ease with which the common law was transplanted in bulk to the US, Australia, New Zealand, and much of Canada, and partially transferred to many other colonies, such as Palestine. This may have something to do with the dominant law-finding technology throughout much of the empire's history, being treatises and legal periodicals rather than case reports, so thus lowering the cost of ascertaining the law on any given question. But the most obvious explanations for the ease of the common law's spread to many lands lie in the realms of politics, culture, and social factors. Now, one could conceptualize all these as transaction costs, but this kind of reductionism would, I think, render the theory largely devoid of any explanatory power. On the other hand, Ron postulates that corporate law in theory should have been relatively portable, given the low transaction costs associated both with its export and import and the benefits of uniformity throughout the empire. But he finds that in practice, its transfer was only partial and very uneven. So here I would like to suggest that economic theory may actually be able to help explain what Ron found on the ground. While it's true that corporate law is typically of little concern to most of a jurisdiction's population, thus seemingly making it a prime candidate for transplantation, public choice theory might suggest that this very characteristic, the fact that corporate law implicates only a small yet highly interested group of people, would make it particularly challenging to transfer. Importing British corporate law was certain to implicate the economic interests of powerful local and imperial elites, and so I think it's unsurprising that it often generated resistance from the expected losers, whoever they were in each case, resistance that was possibly more effective than that generated by changes affecting wide swaths of the population, but less significantly on the individual level. Right? So that's just public choice 101. So to sum up, here I'll end. I'm not sure that markets in ideas or markets in law is the best way to think about legal transplants, whether of economic law or of any other area of law. But I'm sure that Ron and I will continue to debate this for some time.